Welcome back, everybody. My name is Pascal Lotta. We are here on Neutrality Studies, and we are talking again today to my countryman and colleague, Colonel Jacques Baud. Jacques, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you for your support, because I know that you're supporting my case for a long time, and thank you for inviting me again.
Yeah, and we want to actually discuss Iran. And Iran is going to come in like a few minutes. But first, please, can you give us an update about your case? Anyone who doesn't know, you are sanctioned by the European Union. While you yourself are living inside the European Union, you have no bank account, you have no access to your funds, you are not allowed to buy or sell things. You're not even allowed to leave Belgium, where you live. That's just a very short rundown, and this has been going on since December 15. And now, as we speak today on March 17th, where are you with your case?
Well, I'm still, as Judge Napolitano recently said, I'm the most famous sanctioned person in the world. Uh, this is exactly as you explained. The thing that has changed since our last program is that my lawyers have been able to file an application for annulment of the sanction last week to the European Court of Justice. This is not a usual appeal as we do in normal court process, because the decision that was taken against me is not a judicial decision. It's not a judicial decision. It's an extrajudicial decision. It is a political decision made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. So, in essence, my sanctions are a foreign policy measure and not a legal measure. It's very important to say, because people may think that I've done something wrong or something like that. No, I didn't breach any law whatsoever. In Europe or in anywhere in the world. In fact, I'm just exerting my right of free speech. I don't make propaganda. That means the European interpret that way, but that's not what I intend to do. That's always what I try to avoid. In fact, I was invited many times by Russian media, and I refused that, because precisely I wanted to have an academic view an analytical view on the conflict, and not a political view on the conflict. And and that's a little bit the situation where I am. So if I were living in Switzerland, that means outside of the European Union, I wouldn't be affected so much by the sanction. I would be sanctioned in the same way, but there in Switzerland, essentially my bank account would be accessible, and I would have some kind of freedom of movement. I could not go out of Switzerland, since Switzerland is surrounded by the European Union, and I'm in theory not allowed to enter the EU territory. But the problem I have is that I live in the EU, and therefore I'm impacted 100% by those sanctions. And that's a difference with the other sanctioned people who mostly live outside of the European Union, mainly in Russia, so they don't experience the full extent of the sanction. They still have no access to bank accounts in Europe and things like that, but probably some people do not have even a bank account in Europe, and they may not even need to travel to Europe. In my case, I am in Europe, and therefore, as you rightly said, my freedom of movement is therefore impacted very strongly. I cannot visit my family. I cannot visit my daughter. I cannot visit. So I cannot travel. I can't even go to my home country, Switzerland. And if
you're forbidden from traveling over internal EU borders, right? You're not allowed to leave.
That's correct.
Belgium.
That's correct. And in fact, I could apply to have a travel authorization, I could apply to the Belgian government. I could apply to the French government. I can apply to the Luxembourg government to have the authorization to go through their territory. But then, and if I reach Switzerland, I may not be able to go back to my home, and that's the reason why the whole situation is Kafkaesque in a certain way. So this is and that's a unique case. I mean, a half unique case, because there are very similar cases in Europe. But all cases are in fact different, because all the sanction regimes are very different, and the rationale for them are different too, and so on. So and the implication of the governments are also different in all that. Fortunately, the Belgian government has been is rather accommodating in my situation. But other governments may have different view. In Germany, for instance, they may be tougher than in my case. So all situations are very different. But it's a very peculiar situation. Let's put it that way.
The EU sanctions regime is quite scary, also in the sense that it is brand new, and it seems that there's experimenting going on with also what the individual member states are doing. To my knowledge, there's really only one other person in a similar position, because under the Russia sanctions regime, you're under the Russian sanctions, right? That's the one that you're targeted with. There's one more citizen inside the EU, that is Hussein Dogru, a German citizen in Germany, who's also in a similar situation. All others, to my knowledge, are outside the EU, including our compatriot Nathalie Yamp, who is stuck outside, who is stuck on the African continent, and she cannot go back to Switzerland. But EU citizens in the EU, or people inside the EU, I think it's 2 at the moment.
Yes, I think there are 2. Again, I don't want to discuss the case of the German Turkish journalist, because all cases are so different, and there are other issues also related to the GRU than my case, but so that I don't want to discuss, because you can only add confusion when you talk about a case you don't know. I'm talking to myself, of course, and therefore I will not discuss that. The fact of the matter is that these sanctions were originally designed to address countries, or let's say state entities like Gazprom or things like that. The new evolution of the EU is to sanction individuals. And again, when you sanction terrorists, okay, you may have a ground to do that, although the word terrorist needs to be defined, and that's another issue that the West has not been able to solve in the last 100 years or so. In any case, if you sanction, let's say, people belonging to the organized crime, or laundering money, or pedophilia, or you name it, you can say, okay, you may understand something. But the problem of the European Union is that now they resort to sanctioning the speech of individuals, and that's an evolution that is extremely dangerous. And it's dangerous in 2 ways. First of all, because it shows that Europe is afraid of free speech. That's the essence of democracy, is precisely accepting free speech. So when you are afraid of free speech, that means you are no longer in a democratic process. Because even if you have people who are against democracy, they should have the right to express that. And the democracy assumes that you are able to counter the argument of those who are against the democracy. So it's a Darwinian process here. And when you are not able to counter the argument, then you have to forbid people to speak. And that's where we are. And that means that the EU has not enough argument to counter the speech it doesn't like. And that means that's basically, you're right. And that makes the thing. And the second thing, which is quite concerning, is that when you start sanctioning people inside the EU and no longer people that are living outside of the EU, that means that you're above the right. And I think you made at one point a program devoted to explain this extra legality or extrajudiciality of the sanction. When you're extrajudicial, that means you're out of the right. You're no longer in the rule of law. Rule of law means that the state is ruled by law. When you have an extrajudicial decision, that means you're outside of the law. So you're no longer ruled by the law. And when you're not ruled by the law, that means you are in a dictatorship.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube. And although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video. Because the only thing I disagree of what you said is when you said you can sanction you can sanction organized crime or pedophilia or so on. We don't sanction that. We have laws against it. Those are criminal acts.
No, I agree.
Criminalized. So the thing is, you didn't do anything criminal. You didn't.
Absolutely,
You did things
yes,
that are explicitly allowed, and that's why they have to use extrajudicial measures, extra legal measures to get around their own process in order to grab you and hurt you.
Absolutely. You're totally right. I took the example of terrorism because I said, well, okay, it would make sense because the US does that. But you're absolutely right. This is exactly the problem. And that's a very dangerous phase for democracy. And
extremely dangerous. But the Europe is in general in a very precarious moment, also within its own logic. And maybe let's use this as a segue to go to the main topic, which is Iran, and maybe also how Europe approaches Iran. You are, of course, a former colonel of the Swiss army. You're a military man. You have a lot of military training, and you're looking at this through that lens. And you give brilliant analysis, which is one of the reasons why they sanctioned you in the first place. But the logic that you just outlined earlier, we are actually seeing currently a similar type of logic applied to the Iran war, because in Germany, I think it was either the Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, or Armin Laschet, one of the ministers of one of the states, that actually said, I think it was Merz who said that Iran, because Iran broke international law in the past, it can now not hide behind international law. So international law doesn't protect Iran. And this to me is ridiculous, because if we applied that to any kind of thief or whatnot, any lawbreaker in the state, that would mean nobody is protected by law. What do you make out of such rationalizations in Europe toward this clearly, utterly illegal act of aggression and attack on Iran?
Well, that's something we have already seen in the case of Palestine, for instance. That you said, well, when people said, well, the Israelis are bombing civilians, and the reply or the answer was, well, but the Hamas attacked on the 7th of October. And that means that you try to justify a crime with another one. And you cannot justify a crime with another one. This is not possible. Otherwise, our countries would be just the Wild West. In fact, everyone could make justice himself. If you can justify a crime because somebody didn't do things well, then you're allowed to kill him. Also, this is not possible. So we have here, I think, a drift in the Western mentality, which is quite concerning. I mean, even when he was asked about the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran, the Belgian defense minister said, "Well, it's legitimate." So
why so?
Well, but that's where we see that our leadership is, in fact, and that's not completely new. That's the difference between the international law-based order versus the international rules-based order. The law is the law. It is written. It's the UN Charter. It's all the what is written in there, and this is you know exactly what is in there. Therefore, you know when you breach the law, and that's the same in our countries. That's why we have the rule of law. The law defines the way you rule. The law is written. Everybody is supposed to know it, and you know when you breach it. The problem of the rules-based order is that the rules are not defined, or better said, they are defined by some people, but they are not written anywhere. They are simply adjusted depending on the situation. You decide that Iran did this, or you decide it's justified to attack. You decide it's legitimate to attack, and you attack. One of the examples that is mostly mentioned when it comes to Iran is the repression they had in January for the manifestation and the protest they had. I was not there. I didn't know. I don't know exactly what happened. What I see is that nobody knows exactly what happened. We have just figures hanging in the air. You may have some French minister talking about 50,000 victims, Ursula von der Leyen 17. I mean, nobody knows exactly what happened. But based on our ignorance, we say, well, Iran had a harsh repression against protests, and therefore it's legitimate to attack it or to change the regime. And that's again, I mean, let's assume Iran was guilty of using force and exaggerated force or against those protesters. This is not even a justification to attack the country. It's not a justification to bomb the country. And in fact, what you have today in Iran, just as an example, is that you have women who were protesting in January who now are siding with the government against the US. So that shows exactly the illegitimacy of this approach that says, well, because they did something wrong in the past, then we are allowed to do anything today. And that comes then to the declaration of Friedrich Merz, who said that Iran should not be protected by international law. What is that? I mean, this is, as you rightly said, is totally absurd. Why would you retain or prevent anyone, even in a country, let's say in Germany as an example? Well, you would say, well, you're no longer protected by the law. That's a discretionary decision, first of all.
That's why I think it's so similar to what's happening to you. You know, the rationale is the same. Because this other side did something I disapprove of, now all of the construct we build in order to protect people doesn't apply anymore.
Exactly.
It's the same underlying rationale.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. And this is something, this is very dangerous. And all that comes from the fact that we have a very weak decision-making process, in fact, in most countries for everything. You can talk about Iran, you can talk about Venezuela, you can talk about Palestine. We don't have solid decision-making. In fact, we are deciding with our stomach rather than deciding with our brain. That's the problem. And therefore, all the decisions are emotional. They are not thoroughly studied, evaluated, and elaborated. As a result, we come on decisions that are short-term decisions mostly, with no real understanding of what are the future implications of these decisions. We have that right now with the whole issue of energy, for instance. And today we see that Europeans are thinking about going back to Russia to have some energy sources, because they understand that they made a mistake, because they decided in hastily in 2022 and so on. So we see this extremely weak decision making, which is extremely we decide like teenagers, no longer than like governments, like people who have intelligence. I'm come from the intelligence world. That's my previous occupation, and in intelligence, you the idea is that you analyze things regardless of what the political power decides. I mean, if they may agree or not agree, it's not the problem. In the intelligence, you're not here to please the politician. You are there to explain the situation, whatever the situation is. And you may come to an explanation or a representation, a picture of the situation that may not please the politician. That's up to him to take the decision that fits the picture. The problem is that now we tend to have politicians who try to fit the picture to their decision.
When when do you think that this started? Because this is absolutely crucial, and we are seeing right now how one side operates like this, the political West, as Richard Sakwa would call it, the Europe and of course the United States, very haphazard decisions based upon very pure intelligence, very poor understanding of what is going on. And now we have the other sides. We have the Russians that have been for 4 years, relatively, or at least for 3 years, methodologically been implementing the war of attrition, that the second phase that came after the first kind of shock and awe moment, where the strategy was different. But the last 3 years were quite deliberate and meticulous in how they tried to achieve their goals. And we see the same now in Iran. We see how Iran is fighting a war meticulously with a clear strategy and a clear way of how to make life for the United States and Israel quite horrible in the Gulf region. And they are implementing that based upon plans that they have made many years before. How what does that leave us with now in this international environment where violence is unfortunately again a way of communicating what kind of strategies are being used or not used on the Western side?
Well, if you allow me to take this intelligence perspective,
Mhm,
I can say that since the early 90s, this has changed, in fact.
mhm,
During the Cold War, intelligence was based on this bipolar rivalry you had between the communist system, Marxist, I mean, you could call it the different ways, and the Western world. And we had those NATO and the Warsaw Pact facing each other. And of course, there were diverging political issues. But in essence, as it comes to the threat, the strategic threat, you had very similar rationale on both sides. I mean, the Soviet army used also tanks as the US army, and the tanks had the same speed on the ground, almost the same characteristic. Their gun fire at the same rate of fire or same distance and things like this. So it had a lot of commonality. So it was easy to understand and to have a picture of the threat, because you can also rely on your own experience to build this picture. After the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Cold War, we started to put emphasis on other kind of threats. In the first move, that was the organized crime, and then it came very quickly into terrorism and all that. The problem is that in those kind of threats, first of all, you people have not so much experience. I mean, you can address it from a police point of view, and you have police intelligence that can identify individual criminals and all that. But strategically, how do you address organized criminality? The strategic thinking was lacking an intelligence picture, if you want, at strategic level. And that went even further complicated with terrorism, and especially the Islamic terrorism, because then it's no longer, you cannot assess the picture based on your own experience, your own Western culture or experience, because then you are facing individuals, and maybe not even organization, but just individuals who are reacting according to their own culture, according to their own standards, according to their own cultural references and things like this. And that becomes very difficult to understand. And I have written several books on this, because the way we reacted to terrorism, in fact, has just increased terrorism, because we
Sure.
never understood exactly what it was. And the mid 90s, and that was also acknowledged, by the way, by the then director of the CIA. It was, I don't remember his name. I think it was maybe Gates, but I can be wrong on that. In any case, he also realized, and that's something I realized also in the intelligence community in Europe, that the analytical side of the intelligence was no longer as effective as it used to be. And to understand that, when we talk about intelligence, most people think intelligence is about collecting information. And it's very important to understand that basically an intelligence organization is based on two pillars, very schematically. You collect information, and in the second pillar, you analyze information. And the analysis is, in fact, the product of your organization, meaning that you need to collect information, definitely, but more importantly, you have to make sense of the information you collect. Now, with a threat that are scattered with different organizations and things like this, you collect a lot of information, but it becomes more and more difficult to make sense of that information in a strategic, coherent picture. And that's where you have the difficulty that started. And I think no real intelligence organization has really coped with this issue, at least in Europe, as far as I know. And and the result is that we think that collecting more information will improve the quality of your result, but in reality it's the opposite, because the more information you have, some may be useful at police level and things like this, but then it comes to the strategic assessment of the situation, you may have too much information and the tree is hiding the forest. And that's exactly what's going on. And therefore the analytical capabilities of your service is remains extremely weak. And that's a general trend we have observed among all intelligence services. The analytical skills of the intelligence is weakening. And
Well,
that comes then to other issues, because when you talk about Iran, and we see exactly the same thing: Russia, Iran, Palestine, the mess in which we are now, as is the consequence of a bad assessment of the enemy, if you want.
mm,
We always underestimate the capabilities of our adversaries. It may be Russia, it may be Iran, it may be Palestine, it may be others. We always underestimate them, because we don't base on fact. We base on intuitive and emotional assessment, because we don't have the expertise to assess the threat as it is. And that's exactly what we are seeing at play in Iran. This is definitely, despite three operations against Iran before in 2024 and two in 2025, we still haven't understood the capabilities of Iran. Although Iran made made every effort to explain to Israel and the U.S. how capable they were to answer any provocation.
may I ask two things about this? Um, they're not exactly linked, but a little bit. First, how important is the normative framing, or how strong is normative thinking within these intelligence communities that if you start with a certain outlook of the world, and then you build your analytical framework around that, you can only find what fits into that world, right? I mean, the difference between the question of where's the next threat coming from versus where is world peace going to come from, depending on which one you ask, you will find completely different things, right? So it's not just the analysis, but it is the approach toward the analysis. How strong is that component? And then secondly, it seems to me that with Iran, we are actually seeing, and to a good extent also with Russia, we're seeing actually how intelligence communities and also entire political systems are falling for the narratives that they tell themselves about the other, instead of really trying to figure out how the other works. Which is why, even in the German-speaking part of Europe, the idea of a Putin-Versteher, somebody who understands Putin,
Yeah.
it's an insult, right?
Yeah.
So we've kind of tabooed the approach, the attempt at understanding the other. And I remember very clearly 4 years ago, when the Russian war started, that I talked to American Russian experts, who studied Russia for academically, who complained that the level of experts in the West, of Russologists, people, or Sovietologists at the time, right, that they drastically decreased. So there's no more proper understanding of how the other side properly works, and that then informs these very poor stereotypes that based upon which then decisions are taken. Sorry, this is a very long, winded way of asking about these two things. Then the impact of normative frameworks and the impact of like the West believing its own stupid narratives about the other.
Well, I think the two are linked, in fact, and thank you for this question. I think it's a fascinating question, in fact, because it should explain or should inform the way we address crisis. The issue of the normative question is, again, when you start assessing a conventional threat such as the Soviet Union in during the Cold War, you're in a framework that, of course, the Soviet had a different thinking, different doctrine, different political objective, and things like this than the West. But by and large, this is a very similar culture. So you may have some commonalities that helps your analysis to be anchored on a kind of let's say cultural common ground, if I can put it that way, that gives you kind of a normative framework to analyze the adversary, even if there are slight differences, but you can adjust easily those differences. The problem is when you address, for instance, if you talk about Iranians, they are Muslims, obviously. The idea of victory for a Muslim is not exactly the same as for a Westerner. For us, as we have learned in military schools, the victory is defined by the way you destroy your enemy. For a Muslim, generally speaking, the victory is defined by the way you accept to fight, your determination to fight. It's not, the victory is not over the enemy, the victory is over yourself. And that's changed the perspective completely, because in the Western mind, you are constrained by to reaching an objective, and your victory is objective. I mean, the objective of distraction defined. While for a Muslim, it's the objective is in yourself. You don't need. I mean, for a Muslim, you cannot demand to someone to win over a more powerful enemy. If the enemy is more powerful, well, what can you do? But what you certainly have to do is to have the determination to fight. And therefore, the victory is not whether you destroy the enemy, but your victory is that you didn't give up towards the enemy. And that's explained why Ali Khamenei was killed in his office, because he didn't want to give up to the fear of an attack. He went normally to his office, doing his job as his task he was tasked to do, and not hiding. And that's that's also why when you arrest terrorists and things like that, they tend to accuse themselves for more crimes that they actually did, because that
Really?
shows that yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's you have the famous cases. That was I don't know remember his name. That was this guy Sheikh Mohammed. I don't remember his name now. It goes out of my mind. But the FBI had, when they arrested the guy, he was supposed to be the operation chief of Bin Laden or whoever. And when the FBI arrested him, the FBI decided to remove some accusation Mohammed made to himself. Because they knew he couldn't be able to have done that. He was physically not in a position to do the crime he accused himself of, and that's very common. And because the idea is that you have to show the determination to fight, and even if you read but that's a topic in itself. But we are talking about terrorists, of course, and it's not to assume that Iran is terrorist. I refuse this type of categorization. But it explains, and when you read the text of those who establish the theory of armed terrorism, because the jihadi accept the idea of being a terrorist. They accept this idea. They say terrorism is a method, and we agree with this idea that we are terrorists. That's something that nobody in the West would do. They would try to escape the designation as terrorists, but in the jihadi, not. They said, well, it's a method. We use that method for that and that reason, and therefore we assume that. But now in those theories of the terror, it's not the number of casualties which is important. And even it's recommended not to make too much casualties. The idea is not to kill a lot of people. The idea is to show that you are determined to fight. Mm-hmm. That's very important to understand. We have a completely different, and that's the reason why it's easy. When I was myself involved, because in Sudan we were threatened by terrorists, and I was tasked by the head of the mission to made every possible to avoid those threats. This was in 2006 because of the caricatures of Mohammed, and we were targeted because we had Danish and Norwegian officers in the mission. And I had contact with some extremist movement because I was the head of intelligence. And I discussed with those people, and I was tasked to do so. And I went and we discussed with those extremists. And after we discussed, I asked, well, now, should I fear your threat? Are we getting bombed or so? He said, no, we talked. That's fine. That's all right with us. We talked about the topic. No problem. I didn't give a single dollar. I didn't give anything to them. We just talked. And that was it. He could explain his purpose, explain his rationale. I explained mine, ours, because it was the UN. Said, that's fine. And we had no attack whatsoever. So it's very important to understand the mind of people. And I think I assume, again, don't take me wrong here. I am not saying that Iran is terrorist. I completely reject this idea. But the mindset is very similar because it's driven by the same culture.
Yeah, no, I mean this is very, very important. And it's not just culture, it's also this what you just described, terrorism as a method, is of course the application of force, of violence as a method. And that is really nothing different from what Clausewitz taught us about war being the continuation of politics by other means, right? It's just applied to to a different scenario, especially an asymmetric, a highly asymmetric scenario. And that's why all of these liking, or these kind of
Yep.
unfair kind of approaches come from, to say like, oh, Iran is behaving like a terrorist. It's like, well, they are this weaker part, they are definitely, but you're the ones who are using violence in the first place, and they're using violence back. But what we're in is actually a form of negotiation about the political future of this region. And while the Western side, the Americans and Israelis, are highly brutal in their approach of trying to steamroll over everything, the Iranians tend to be very methodological with what they're attacking. Maybe we can use this to talk a little bit about this. What does their methodology of implementing the war, of using violence, tell us about how they are approaching this? This, it is a huge power. It's not as huge as we thought, but it is a huge power.
Well, you see, I mean, if you look at what happened in the different operations, I mean, you had, as I said, three previous attacks of the Israelis and the US against Iran in 2024, 2025, and obviously the fourth on this year. But if you look at the reaction of Iran, the Israelis, when they attacked, every time, even if they tried to pinpoint some Hamas leaders or things like that, they made a lot of casualties. The Iranians replied, and they made almost no casualties. In 2024, they reacted. They shot their missiles. They went through the Iron Dome and all the air defense of the Israelis. They struck Israeli military bases. They made no victims. And what we see today, for instance, when you see the reaction of the Iranians, the response, they made very few casualties in Israel. They don't target individual. They try to avoid. I mean, you certainly have some casualties in Israel. It's not that there are no casualties. Not what I mean. But they don't target individual. They try to keep themselves in a very tight targeting discipline. They target military objective as much as they can. Again, you may have civilian casualties. That's what is called collateral damage. That means that those people were not targeted, but they were affected by simply because they were close to the initial objective. But we see that the Iranians are extremely careful to avoid civilian casualties. While when you see the Israeli and US attack that they started 2 weeks ago, they already in the first day, you had hundreds of civilian victims. Yeah. So we see that there is a different approach. The idea, and that's exactly what I explained with those terrorist examples. In the Muslim mind, this is not the idea that you need to make a lot of casualties. And it's very interesting, by the way, that in the Western conventional wisdom, you hear very often that the Iranians understand only force, or the Palestinians understand only force or violence. It's totally wrong. You could achieve much better result by not addressing the issue with violence. But that's something we don't accept, because in our culture, again, we have this idea that a victory cannot be achieved without crushing your enemy.
Yeah, while it's projection. It's a typical kind of because you know that you yourself only understand that. You would only stand down if you're defeated, so you think that the other one reacts the same. Therefore, you then justify that. It's classical projection.
Yes, it is. It is, and that's the problem we have with Iran, as with other countries. In fact, there is from that point of view, there was not a single war that we fought in the last 25 years or so, that not a single one was justified in any sense, even if you might consider that some, like Saddam Hussein also, may have represented some kind of threat. Because, and that's my experience, because I have been in those regions, of course, involved in smaller conflict and things like this. But I understood that essentially, if you try to understand your adversary, you can negotiate with him. And negotiate doesn't mean that you have to give something. Exactly what happened with the example I just gave about the terrorists. You don't have to give something. You just have to listen to them. And that's fine. That's okay. You don't need to pay them. You don't have to give them an advantage. The thing is, and that's also the reason why somebody don't expect, for instance, we're talking about a possible assault on an island of Kharg in Iran. And I'm convinced that if the Americans do that, the Iranians are ready to destroy the whole thing, including the whole oil installation, refineries, and all that, just to destroy the enemy. They don't care about destroying, because that's something also that I learned when I was in Africa. That is something not obvious for a Westerner. But a person told me, we are born naked and we'll die naked.
All of these aspects now are leading again to a asymmetric war that is, with every passing day, tilted more and more in favor of Iran, of actually, achieving some of its goals. And they defined them, for instance, as like expelling the Americans out of the region, forcing them to withdraw all of their war-making assets, so that a new attack cannot happen. Some other demands are like reparations and so on, but especially like expelling them from the region. It seems now not a lunatic idea anymore that they might get close to that, not least because they actually make a point that, by the way, Gulf states, if you harbor any of this material and these people, well, then you're a target too. So in a sense, they're in my view, sending a very clear signal that what they want is a neutral region that is not an ally of the United States, do not need to be allies of Iran, but cannot be allies of the US. Do you also see it like that?
Well, in fact, you had, I think it was a personality of the UAE, a billionaire or so, that made a public comment. I think it was even an open letter to the US or something like that. I may be wrong on that, but at least what he said in substance is that, well, he said to the US, well, you dragged us into a war we never agreed for. And that's exactly the problem. When you have those bases scattered around the Middle East, with the clear aim targeting Iran, that means that somehow you are part of the plot when you accept those bases. And that's exactly what Iran is trying to explain. And the Prime Minister Arakchi, and I think Larry Janney also said so, that he said to the Middle East country, Arab countries, he said, well, we have nothing against you. We are trying to get rid of the threat of the US that is based on your territory. The problem is that it's on your territory, but we are not targeting you. And that's also something, if you read the rhetoric of the West, if you look at the communique that was issued by the European, the E3, UK, Germany, and France on the 1st of March, they said, well, Iran is targeting Middle East countries. It's not exactly true, because Iran specified that they didn't target the countries themselves. They target the U.S. bases. The same applies to Cyprus. You can see that in the rhetoric recently, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said that the Iran targeted Cyprus EU countries. No, it's not true. In fact, the target were on British territory, because the bases that are on Cyprus are sovereign territory of the UK. It's not the territory of Cyprus. So
Yeah.
we play with word in order to show that Iran tried to escalate the conflict and tried to
Mhm.
target a lot of countries. In fact, Iran has been extremely disciplined, extremely consistent with this response, had targeted only those targets that are related to those territory that belong in some way to the US
Yeah. And
and the UK.
yeah, and Ali Larijani 2 or 3 days ago put out a tweet actually saying that there are rumors that a false flag attempt might be made
Yes.
in the United States to attack a civilian infrastructure and blame Iran. And he just preemptively said, "We would not do something like that. This is not in our interest. We do not have a
Yes.
war with the people of the United States. We're at war with the military of the United States, not with the
Exactly.
people." So he just put that out there, and it's the same logic of saying like, no, 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 this is a military to military affair, and
Yeah.
whatever you do and throw at us and target our civilians, we are not doing that on your side, and we are not trying to fight the US people. We're
Exactly.
just fighting those installations that attack us.
Exactly. So it's not an escalation, and that's what something you hear in the European rhetoric, that Iran is escalating the conflict. No, it's not. It's just fighting the countries that attacked him. The problem is that the US and the UK are in fact using these Middle East countries and Cyprus as a
Yeah,
so-called sanctuary to fight Iran.
yeah,
And this is exactly what you had in the 60s with the Viet Cong using Laos as a sanctuary. So they made a raid against the US in Vietnam and then withdrew very quickly into sanctuaries in Laos. And that's exactly the same thing we have here. The US is using those sanctuaries in the Middle East,
yeah.
in Arab countries.
What frustrates me so much is that all of this dynamic is very well understood. This is the very reason why the international law of neutrality says that if you want to be neutral, then you cannot have bases, you cannot harbor these soldiers unless they surrender, and you keep them under custody and so on. I mean, basically defang everything, right? And that is well understood because that's exactly what you would expect. That's exactly
Yes.
what happened in the 18th century, in the 19th century. This is not any rocket science. This is nothing new. So
Yeah.
the fact that now these countries complain and the Europeans go like, how could they attack a
Yeah.
sovereign state, Qatar and Dubai? It's utter madness to me.
Well, and that's exactly what they want to replicate with Ukraine.
Right.
You see, that's exactly the same thing. So we understand the logic, because we
Mhm.
would do exactly the same if you were in the same situation. The problem is, again, we are back to the beginning of our discussion. We are
Mhm.
no longer in the rule of international law, or the international law based order. We are in the rule based order. So we define the rules, and the rules apply as we want. When we decide that Iran should not be protected by international law, then we decide so. That's exactly the difference. International law is international law, period. And
Just
attacking Iran, regardless of how good or bad is the government or whoever, attacking Iran is attacking Iran.
yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Destroying civilians is destroying civilians. Using disproportionate force against civilian is using disproportionate force against civilians. There are no good reason to kill children. There are no good reason to kill civilians, unprotected civilians. There's no good reason. Period. That's there is no Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever. There is no good reason to kill
No.
these armed civilians.
The Ambassador Chas Freeman made that observation about a year ago in an essay, and then he talked about this on this channel, that the big difference is that what we all know what we want is the rule of law. What the West is implementing with this rules-based order is the rule by law, is having some vague kind of principles, and then you apply them here, but not there, and certainly not to yourself, and thereby you try then to rule over everybody, right, in order to dominate. And that's the approach that seems to be failing now. So my hope is that we will somehow realize that and shift back and say, like, no, okay, fine, these rules, the universal rules apply to us too. Now let's get back to the original idea of the UN, and not this bastardized kind of behavior that we're seeing at the moment.
Well, the thing is, that all these wars that we decide, because there is all the wars that were started in the last 30 years or so, or the last quarter of century, are in fact all wars of choice.
Yes.
The problem is, and now you see, you look at what is at stake in the world today. We're talking about China coming up with IA and things like that, or AI, sorry, I'm mixing the AI. What you see in Europe, and in the West at large, we are very much backwards regarding new technologies and all that, because we spend so much energy, time, and money to wage useless wars around the world. We destabilize countries that could be our partners, that could be trade partners, but we destabilize them completely. The result is that people in those countries, and namely the Middle East, take Syria, Iraq, and so on, it's so impossible to live there, that those people are coming as migrants in our country. And now we have a problem in our country because some people are struggling to fight against migration and all that. We created the situation. So we spend money for nothing, basically, with no return on investment, zero. We just had people killed there. We killed people, and we had our own people killed. We didn't gain anything. We spent money that could have been otherwise useful to develop technologies that we need now. China has not engaged into any war. As a result, they could develop their research and development and all that. Now we are backwards because we participated in all that. And today, what are we doing? We try to portray a future war in Europe that is absolutely baseless when you look at the facts on the ground. And instead of investing in something which would be useful for the future of our children, for our grandchildren, we invest in things that will be useless, that will just continue to, in fact, increase tensions. And we will not even be able to cope with the, let's say, technological competition that is provided by countries like China, and tomorrow maybe India. We're not even able to do that.
Yep. Fools, just foolish approaches, just
totally
utter foolishness. But look, Jacques, I'm very glad that you give us very sober analysis, even as one of the few sanctioned people inside the EU. Thank you for doing all of that. I mean, great job, and great service actually to everybody, because it helps, it gives clarity. People who want to find your analysis, is there a place where they should go to read up on what you produce?
Well, mostly my book, and the very last book I have is behind me. This is Peace in Ukraine, which describes the whole peace process, or the various peace processes that were initiated and never ended or never achieved their objective in Ukraine, and what are the rationale for peace. And it's not a book about war; it's a book about peace in Ukraine, and is the last one that is just published just last week.
And these books are, of course, now forbidden in the European Union. So,
no, they are not forbidden. They are not forbidden. They are not forbidden at all.
You're not allowed to earn anything with them.
Well, I'm not allowed. I mean, of course, I receive. I mean, my publisher has the royalties for me. He cannot give the royalties to me, so he keeps them in account. But the book are not forbidden at all, despite the fact that in France there is a bookstore chain which is called Fnac, who decide on their initiative, because there is no legal obligation for that. They decide to withdraw all my books from the shelves. But the honest bookstores, bookshops, sell my books. The dishonest one don't. So don't go to the dishonest one. And you find them on Amazon, of course.
Everybody don't go to Fnac, but please do buy Jacques Baud's book, Peace in Ukraine. It's by now an act of resistance to do so.
Absolutely.
Jacques Baud, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.